The day my mother was buried, my son laughed at me across a mahogany table. Not a small laugh, not an awkward one, a full, chest-deep laugh, the kind that fills a room and empties it of everything decent at the same time. He had just inherited Vale Industrial, billion-dollar empire, steel, legacy, power. I got the old house. Everyone in that room looked at me with pity. Some looked away entirely. But the lawyer hadn't finished speaking. And what came next? What Marion Vale had been quietly building for years inside those crumbling walls would change everything. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because what that lawyer revealed will shake you to your core. I have replayed that morning 1,000 times in my head. The light through the funeral home windows, the smell of lilies that I've hated ever since. The sound of Derek's polished shoes on the marble floor as he walked in 20 minutes late, straightening his cufflinks like the whole ceremony had been scheduled around his inconvenience. My mother, Marion Vale, had been gone for 4 days. 4 days, and already I could feel the shape of the world changing without her in it. Like a tooth pulled clean, the absence of her louder than her presence had ever been. I sat in the front row at the reading of the will. Derek sat 2 seats away from me, and he didn't look at me once. Not when I walked in. Not when the lawyer, Caleb Rourke, settled his briefcase onto the long mahogany table and cleared his throat. Not when Derek's own assistant leaned over and whispered something in his ear that made the corner of his mouth curl upward. He already knew what he was getting. I understand that now. He had made it his business to know. What? Let me back up. Because to understand that room, that table, that laugh, you have to understand what Marion Vale built and what it cost her and what it meant to the people who loved her. Marion didn't inherit Vale Industrial. She built it from nothing, from a single steel fabrication shop in a dying mill town called Greer, Pennsylvania. She had been 26 years old, newly widowed, with a 2-year-old daughter, me, and $11,000 she'd borrowed from her own mother against the deed of a farmhouse. She used to tell the story with her hands. She'd spread them wide over the kitchen table like she was laying out a blueprint. $11,000 and a union of stubborn men who believed in fair wages, she'd say. That's all it took. That and 40 years of not sleeping enough. She was not a soft woman. She never had been. She didn't hug easily or apologize often. She had a way of looking at you that could feel like a verdict, like she had already assessed the situation and found her conclusion before you finished your sentence. But she was fair, deeply, stubbornly fair. She paid her workers above market rate before it was fashionable. She turned down 2 acquisition offers in the 90s because she didn't trust the buyers to keep the pension promises. She built a small medical clinic for workers' families on the edge of the factory campus and paid for it herself. She loved the company the way some people love a child. Carefully, with discipline, with a long view. And she loved me, though she showed it in ways I sometimes didn't recognize until years later. A piece of advice delivered bluntly over the phone, a check for Derek's school fees with no note attached, showing up to my hospital room at 2 in the morning when I had my appendix out, sitting in the chair in the corner, not saying a word, just being there. That was Marion, presence over words, action over softness. Yeah, Derek was her only grandchild. He was 29 when she died. He had come into the company 3 years earlier, not through merit, but through persistence, and the last name Vale on his resume. Marion had hired him into a junior management role, I think because she wanted to give him a chance, because she saw something in him she hoped she could shape. I had disagreed with that decision from the beginning, and I had told her so. "He's not ready," I said. We were in her kitchen. She was making coffee the way she always did. Too strong, no sugar. "He thinks the name does the work. He doesn't understand what the work actually is." "He'll learn," she said. "From who? He doesn't listen to anyone." She looked at me then, that long, assessing look. "He'll learn from watching what happens when you don't." I didn't understand what she meant, not until much later. What I did understand was that Derek had spent those 3 years at Vale Industrial not learning the business but positioning himself within it. He cultivated relationships with board members over golf. He attended investor dinners and spoke confidently about strategy he had read about that morning. He was charming, genuinely charming in the way that very dangerous people sometimes are. And he had a gift for making powerful men feel that he shared their vision. He also had a habit of cutting people down when he thought no one important was watching. I watched. I always watched. I saw him dismiss the head of operations, a woman named Ruth Chen, who had been with the company for 22 years, in a hallway conversation so brief and contemptuous that the security guard standing nearby looked at his shoes in secondhand embarrassment. I saw him renegotiate supply contracts in ways that technically stayed within Marion's directives, but violated the spirit of the relationship she had built. I saw him look at the factory floor workers the way some people look at furniture: useful, replaceable, beneath consideration. And every time I brought it to Marion, she listened. She absorbed it. She didn't defend him exactly, but she also didn't move against him. "Leave it," she'd say. "Mom, leave it, Evelyn. I'm handling it." I didn't know what handling it looked like. I thought maybe she was in denial. I thought maybe she was tired or protecting him out of some grandmother's love I couldn't see the edges of. I thought, some nights when I was being uncharitable to myself, that she trusted him more than she trusted me. That thought was the one that hurt the most. She got sick in January. Pancreatic cancer, which had the particular cruelty of moving fast and offering no negotiation. By March, she was in the house, the old house, the one on Callaway Road, because she refused to die in a hospital and had made that position very clear to her doctors, her attorney, and anyone else who suggested otherwise. I moved in to take care of her. I slept in the room that had been mine at 16. I cooked soup she mostly didn't eat. I sat with her in the evenings while she looked out the window at the oak trees that had been there since before she was born, and sometimes she talked, and sometimes she didn't, and I tried to honor whatever she needed. Derek visited 4 times in 3 months. 4 times. I counted. The first time he came in looking distracted, his phone in his hand, and he stayed 40 minutes. The second time he brought flowers she didn't ask for and talked about the company's Q1 numbers like she was a board member reviewing performance. She listened without expression. When he left, she said to me quietly, "He thinks I'm already gone." "He doesn't mean it like that," I said, because she was my mother and I was tired and I didn't want to talk about Derek. She looked at me. "Yes, he does." The third visit, he sat with her for 20 minutes and spent most of it on a phone call in the hallway that he thought I couldn't hear. He was talking to someone about a contract, a supplier deal, while his grandmother was dying in the next room. The fourth visit was the week before she died. He held her hand for about 5 minutes. She was quiet by then, spending more time asleep than awake. He leaned down and kissed her forehead and said, "I'll make you proud, Grandma." After he left, she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Will he?" she said, not to me, just into the air. I didn't answer. I held her hand and watched the oak trees move outside the window. She died on a Thursday morning in April, with the window open and birds making noise in the yard, and me sitting in the chair beside her, holding a cup of coffee I'd forgotten to drink. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday at Caleb Rourke's offices downtown. I dressed carefully that morning, not because I was expecting anything grand. Marion had always been private about her plans, and I had learned not to assume, but because I wanted to show up the way she would have wanted me to. Composed, presentable, dignified. I arrived 10 minutes early. Caleb was already there, his briefcase on the table, his expression professionally neutral in the way only lawyers and surgeons manage. There were a few other people, 2 members of the board who were named in some capacity, Marion's longtime personal assistant, Margaret, and a cousin named Harold who had driven 3 hours from Ohio and would spend the entire reading looking like he was bracing for a car crash. And then Derek. He came in at 11 past the hour, which was 11 minutes late, which was, I would come to understand, entirely deliberate. He had his assistant with him, a thin, efficient young man named Kyle, who always looked slightly afraid. Derek himself looked perfectly groomed, perfectly calm, in a suit that probably cost more than my car payment. He sat down across the table. Kyle sat to his right. Derek looked around the room the way you look around a room when you've already decided you own it. He didn't look at me. "Should we get started?" he said to Caleb. Caleb said, "We'll begin at 11:15. Derek checked his watch, nodded, pulled out his phone. I sat very still and breathed. "What?" I had not talked to my son in a meaningful way in over a year. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. They assume the estrangement was sudden, a single event, one bad conversation, a door slammed. But it wasn't like that. It was slow. It was the accumulation of 100 small moments over 3 or 4 years where I would reach out and he would be just barely present, just barely engaged, just polite enough that I couldn't call it cruelty, but cold enough that I always walked away feeling hollowed out. It was the Christmas he spent 3 minutes on the phone with me and then told me he had a dinner to get to. It was the birthday card he sent 2 weeks late with a gift receipt tucked inside and no handwritten note. It was the time I had a small health scare. Nothing serious, as it turned out, but frightening enough in the moment. And when I called him, he said, "Let me know how it goes." And I didn't hear from him again for 6 weeks. It was the way he talked about the company like it was already his. "When I'm running things," he'd say, present tense framed as future. Not if, not someday. When? And not running things together, not building on what Marion started. Running things his way, his vision, his direction. I had worked in the company too, in the early years, in operations, in HR, on the floor when I had to be. I knew those workers. I had hired some of them. I had been there for contract negotiations and community hearings and the terrible winter of 2009 when the whole industry nearly collapsed and Marion kept every single person on payroll by refinancing her own home. Derek knew none of that. He had never asked. Caleb cleared his throat at exactly 11:15 and opened the folder in front of him. The first provisions were straightforward. Small bequests to Margaret, to a few longtime employees, to a scholarship fund Marion had quietly maintained for 30 years at the local community college. Harold got a set of antique pocket watches that had belonged to their grandfather, and the expression on his face was such pure relief that I almost laughed. Then Caleb set those pages aside and picked up a fresh sheet. "To my grandson, Derek James Vale," he read, "I leave Vale Industrial Holdings in full, the entirety of its assets, its stock, its contracts, its employees, and its obligations, effective immediately upon the finalization of estate proceedings." The room shifted. Derek sat back slightly. Not surprised, but satisfied. He didn't smile yet. He was performing restraint, but I could see it in his jaw, in the way his shoulders settled, the confirmation of what he had expected all along. Kyle wrote something on his notepad. Caleb continued. "To my daughter, Evelyn Marie Vale, I leave the family residence at 412 Callaway Road, the original Vale property, in its entirety, including all structures, outbuildings, and contents thereof." He stopped reading. The room was silent for 2 full seconds, and then Derek laughed. Not a small, disbelieving exhale, not a brief, embarrassed sound he quickly suppressed. He laughed, head back, full-throated, the kind of laugh that has contempt built into its foundation, the kind of laugh that is not about finding something funny, but about making sure everyone in the room understands the hierarchy. "The house," he said, when he'd recovered enough to speak. He looked at me then, for the first time. "She gave you the house." I didn't say anything. "Mom?" He said it like it was the punchline. "She gave you the old house." Harold was looking at the table. Margaret had gone very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression something I couldn't read. The 2 board members exchanged a glance. I felt the blood leave my face. Not from shame or not only shame, but from the sheer physical impact of being laughed at by my own child in a room full of people who could not help me. "Derek," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "That's enough." "I'm just saying," he said, spreading his hands with that charming, infuriating ease. "You always said she'd take care of you. Guess she did." I said that's enough. He was still smiling, not at me anymore, at Kyle, who looked like he wished he were anywhere else on earth. Caleb had not moved. He had not reacted. He was watching, with that particular stillness of someone who knows the conversation has not yet arrived at its actual content. "There is," Caleb said, in a voice that was quiet and completely without inflection, "one remaining provision." The smile on Derek's face didn't disappear, but it paused, just for a fraction of a second. There's a sealed clause, Caleb said, which Mrs. Vale instructed be read following the primary disbursements and not before. I'll need a moment to prepare the document. Derek leaned back. Sure, he said. Take your time. But something had shifted in the room. I don't know how to explain it except to say that the air had changed, the way it does before a storm when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel cold water before you see it. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Caleb opened a secondary envelope, thick, wax-sealed, the kind of envelope that means someone took great care with what was inside. He broke the seal deliberately. He unfolded the pages inside. He read to himself for a brief moment, and then he looked up. Mrs. Vale's sealed provision, he said, includes both a written clause and a recording. She requested that both be shared in this proceeding. Derek shifted in his chair. A recording? A video. Of what? Of Mrs. Vale. Caleb's voice was even. Recorded approximately 6 weeks before her death. Derek glanced at Kyle again. The smirk had thinned into something smaller, more cautious. I wasn't told about a recording. You weren't intended to be, Caleb said. And then he read the clause. I won't give you the legal language because I didn't absorb all of it in the moment. I was sitting too still, breathing too carefully, trying to hold myself together in front of all these people. But the substance of it was this. Derek's inheritance of Vale Industrial was conditional, not simply given. Conditional. There were 3 pillars. 1, the workforce. Derek was required to maintain the current employment structure for a minimum of 5 years, with no mass layoffs, no benefit reductions, and no outsourcing of the foundational operations. 2, the debts. Marion had made specific commitments to suppliers and community partners, commitments that were documented, that amounted to several $million in obligations, and those commitments had to be honored in full. 3, the founding estate. 412 Callaway Road, but the old house, had to remain intact. No sale, no development, no transfer. If it was ever sold, demolished, or stripped, the reversal clause activated. The reversal clause. I heard Derek say, very quietly, "What reversal clause?" Caleb looked up from the document. If any of the 3 conditions are violated, he read, full control of Vale Industrial Holdings reverts from Derek James Vale to Evelyn Marie Vale, with immediate effect, as documented in the trust structure held by this firm. The room went completely silent. I looked at Caleb. He met my eyes for just a moment, and in that moment I understood, not everything, not yet, but enough, that my mother had not left me behind. She had left me a loaded weapon and the wisdom to know when to fire it. Derek's voice, when it came, was different from before, flatter, harder. That's not valid, he said. It's entirely valid, Caleb replied. It was drawn up by this firm in consultation with 3 external legal advisors and reviewed by the estate court prior to Mrs. Vale's death. It has been registered. She was sick. She was on medication. She was mentally competent at the time of signing, as attested to by her physician. Caleb's tone did not change. I was present. Margaret was present. Derek turned to his assistant. I could see from across the table that his jaw was tight. Get Harmon on the phone. Mr. Vale, Caleb said, I'd encourage you to hear the recording before making any decisions. A pause, long enough that I counted 4 seconds in my head. Fine, Derek said. The word was a stone dropped into water. Caleb reached into his briefcase and set a small digital player on the table. He pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the room. I want to describe what that was like, hearing her voice 4 days after we buried her, but I'm not sure I have the language for it. It was like a hand reaching through the wall of absence she'd left behind. It was her, completely her. That particular cadence, that deliberate pace, the way she never wasted words. If you're hearing this, she said, then the will has been read, and I expect the atmosphere in that room is somewhat charged. There was a pause that sounded almost like amusement. I'll be brief. Derek, She said his name without warmth and without cruelty. Matter of fact. I love you. I want you to know that before I say anything else. You're my blood, and I love you. But love is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as proof. I have watched you for 3 years inside the company I built, and what I have seen has made me certain of 2 things: that you have real capability, and that you have not yet chosen to use it for anything other than yourself. Derek was very still across the table. His hands were flat on the wood surface, not moving. The conditions I have set are not punishments. They are a framework, a test, if you want to call it that. I believe that the right structure, the right pressure, the right accountability can change what a person chooses to be. I have seen it happen. I have done it myself. But if I am wrong about that, if you choose the fast path over the right one, then the company belongs with Evelyn. Not because she is my daughter and I love her, though I do, because she understands what Vale Industrial is. She has always understood it. She was there at the beginning, even when she was too small to know she was watching. I was not going to cry. I had made myself a promise about that, but my throat had closed up somewhere around "she was there at the beginning," and I was sitting very rigidly, staring at a fixed point on the table. The old house, Marion continued, is not a consolation prize. Evelyn, if you're wondering, and I know you are, stop. I need you to go to the house. I need you to look in the east wing. There are things there that will explain more than I can say here. I have been putting this together for a long time. The recording ended. The silence was total. And then, without meaning to, I looked at Derek. He was looking at me. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever, in any real way, I couldn't read his face. The meeting broke apart the way these things do, with the formal exchange of documents, the cautious words of lawyers, the avoiding of eyes. Harold shook my hand and said something I didn't hear. Margaret touched my arm as she passed. One of the board members, Gerald Purcell, who had been with the company since the early 90s and had an office on the 4th floor that smelled like pipe tobacco, even though he'd quit 15 years ago, stopped in front of me on his way to the door. "She made the right call," he said very quietly. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Caleb handed me a separate folder before I left. "There are documents you'll need to review," he said. "The house, the trust structure, a few other things she prepared for you specifically. Take your time, but don't take too long." "Why?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Because Derek is going to move fast. He always does." I drove out to Callaway Road that afternoon. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive behind an old iron gate that had been sticking on its hinge for 20 years. I had to lift and push at the same time, the way I'd learned as a child, the exact angle to get it to swing. It still worked. Some things do. It was May. The yard was overgrown in that particular way of places that have not been actively neglected but simply not attended to. Long grass, the rose bushes my mother had planted in 1988 threatening to overtake the front walk, the great oak in the east corner just starting to leaf. The house itself was sound structurally. My mother had kept it maintained even after she moved into the downtown apartment she'd lived in for the last decade. She'd paid a service to come twice a year. New roof in 2018, gutters replaced in 2021. But it had the feeling of a house that was holding its breath, waiting. I unlocked the front door with the key from my own keyring. I'd had one for 30 years, and stepped into the front hallway. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant. Dust and old wood and something faint and floral that I thought, for a disorienting moment, was my mother's perfume, before I understood it was probably soap from a drawer left open somewhere. But for a second, just a second, it was her. I stood in the hallway and breathed. Then I went to the east wing. The east wing was what the family had always called the addition my grandfather had built in the 1950s. 3 rooms off the main corridor, slightly lower ceiling than the rest of the house, with floors that creaked in a specific sequence when you walked down the hall. I had played in those rooms as a child. The first had been a sitting room. The second had been a study that nobody used. The third had always been locked. It was still locked. I looked at the key ring in my hand. 5 keys. I'd had 3 of them for 30 years. The other 2 had come from Caleb's office, tagged with small labels in Marion's handwriting. The first new key opened the second room. I stepped inside. It was a study, but it was nothing like the empty room I remembered from childhood. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, legal size, lined the far wall. On the desk, arranged with intention, were 3 leather-bound ledgers and a small wooden box. On top of the ledgers was a single piece of notepaper in Marion's handwriting. Evelyn, don't try to read everything tonight. Start with the red ledger, then the box. The third room will make more sense after. Trust your gut. You always had good instincts. I just didn't tell you often enough. M. My hand was shaking. I picked up the red ledger. I don't want to get into everything that was in it that night, because the full picture only came together over the course of the weeks that followed, and because some of it will mean more when I tell you what happened next with Derek, and with the company, and with everything Marion had been quietly building while the world watched her die. But I'll tell you this. The first page of the red ledger contained a list of transactions spanning 12 years, transactions that Derek had initiated or influenced or benefited from, transactions that technically fell within his authority, but that, taken together, formed a pattern that Marion had documented with the quiet, relentless thoroughness of a woman who had been watching and waiting and collecting evidence for a very long time. She had known. She had known everything, and she had waited, not out of weakness, not out of blind love, but because she had needed him to show her exactly who he was before she built the trap around him. I sat down in the old desk chair and read until it was dark outside, and the creak of the house settling around me sounded, if I let it, like company. Outside, somewhere across town, Derek was already making phone calls. I didn't know that yet. I would find out soon enough. But that night, in that room, with my mother's handwriting in my lap, and the smell of old paper and the dark settling around the house on Callaway Road, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope. Not exactly. Something harder than hope. Something that had edges. My mother had looked at everything my son was, all the arrogance, all the ambition, all the contempt. And she had not flinched, and she had not surrendered, and she had not left me with nothing. She had left me with everything. The question was what I was going to do with it. The morning after I spent the night in Marion's study, I woke up in the old house with my neck aching and the red ledger still open in my lap. I hadn't meant to sleep there. I'd meant to read a little, get my bearings, drive back to my apartment. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, the words had blurred on the page and exhaustion had pulled me under, and I had slept in my dead mother's desk chair with her handwriting pressed against my chest like a compass. I made coffee in the old kitchen. The burner still worked. The can of ground coffee in the cupboard was only a few months old, which told me Marion had been coming here more recently than I'd realized. And I stood at the window looking out at the backyard while the light came up gray and slow through the oak trees. I had a choice to make. Not the big choice, not yet, but a first one. I could take everything I'd found in the red ledger and go straight to Caleb. I could get ahead of Derek before he had a chance to move. I could make the first call instead of receiving it. Or I could wait. Watch. Let him show me what he was going to do, the way Marion had. I stood there a long time drinking bad coffee, thinking about patience. My mother had been patient for 12 years. 12 years of watching and documenting and not reacting, not tipping her hand, not letting Derek know what she knew. There had been times, I could see it now, reading between the lines of those ledgers, when she must have wanted to confront him directly, when whatever he'd done must have made her furious in that quiet, sealed way of hers. But she hadn't. She had waited until she had everything. I was not my mother. I didn't have 12 years. And I wasn't sure I had her particular brand of cold patience, but I had her notes. And I had the second room still to open. I went back to the east wing. The second key, the last new one on the ring, fit the lock on the third room cleanly. The door swung open on hinges that had been recently oiled. She had planned for this. She had oiled those hinges knowing someone would be coming through this door after she was gone, and she hadn't wanted the creak to feel like resistance. That small thing undid me more than almost anything else. I stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. It was not a large room. It had been a storage room when I was a child, full of boxes and old furniture and the particular disorder of things kept because they might someday be useful. It was none of those things now. Marian had converted it, sometime in the past several years, into what I could only describe as a command center, though that makes it sound more dramatic than it looked. It was orderly, careful. The walls held shelving units, and the shelves held labeled binders, dozens of them, organized by year and category. There was a flat filing cabinet against the far wall, and on top of it a fireproof lockbox. On the center table, a laptop, closed, with a sticky note on the lid that said simply, "Password is your first dog's name." Capital first letter, Pepper. Our spaniel from when I was 8 years old. I opened the laptop. I typed in Pepper, and the screen came to life. There was a single folder on the desktop, labeled with my name. Inside it, 17 files. I pulled out the desk chair, sat down, and began. I won't walk through every file because some of them were legal in nature and require context I didn't have yet, and some of them I'm still processing even now as I tell you this story. But I'll tell you what I found in broad strokes because it matters to understanding everything that happened in the weeks that followed. The first file was a trust document, 83 pages, dense with legal language, but with sections flagged in yellow highlighting and notes in the margins in Marian's handwriting. The short version, the trust that governed Vale Industrial's ownership structure was not simply a will provision. It was a living trust constructed over years, and its terms were more complex than what Caleb had read aloud in the conference room. Derek's control of the company was real, but it was conditional in ways that went deeper than the three conditions. There were performance benchmarks, audit requirements, employee satisfaction metrics tied to compensation. Marian had built accountability into the architecture of the company itself, and Derek didn't know the full structure existed. The second file was a summary of patent records. Vale Industrial held 47 active patents. What I had not known, what nobody outside of Marian and Caleb had apparently known, was that the controlling documentation for 11 of the most valuable patents, including 3 foundational ones from the company's earliest years, was registered to the Callaway Road estate address, not to the company's corporate office. They were physically here, in this house. And the chain of title ran through Marian personally, not through Vale Industrial as a corporate entity. If those patents were not properly transferred, if the documentation was contested, or if the property that held the registration was compromised, the patent's validity could be challenged. The old house was not just a house. It was part of the company's legal spine. I had to read that twice before it settled. The third file I opened was not a legal document. It was a letter, handwritten, scanned. 3 pages in Marian's careful, slightly slanted script, addressed to me. I'm not going to reproduce it in full because parts of it are private in a way I want to keep. But there was one passage near the end that I have read so many times since that I can recite it without looking. She wrote, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner what I was planning. I was afraid you would try to stop me, not out of weakness, but because you are kinder than I am, and you would have wanted to give him more chances. I have already given him more chances than he deserved. I gave him them because I loved him, and because I know that what is broken in him did not come from nowhere. But love is not the same as permission. I should have told you that a long time ago. I should have said it out loud." I sat with that for a while. Then I closed the laptop, put the key in my pocket, and went to make another cup of bad coffee. Derek called on a Wednesday. 4 days after the reading of the will, 4 days after I'd started spending my nights in the old house, working through Marian's files. I saw his name on the screen and stood in the kitchen holding the phone for 3 rings before I answered. "Mom." His voice was different from the reading, controlled, businesslike. The warmth he could deploy when he needed it, that social warmth, the kind that had no heat underneath it, was present but thin. "We should talk." "We are talking," I said. A brief pause. He didn't like that. "I mean in person. I think there are things that need to be discussed between the two of us before they get complicated." "What kind of things?" "The house," he said. "The conditions. All of it. I think there may have been some miscommunication around Grandma's intentions. I'd like to sit down with you and work through it." Miscommunication. I turned the word over in my mind. It was a very specific choice. Not disagreement, not dispute. Miscommunication, which implied that the problem was clarity, not content. That if we simply talked it through, reasonable people would arrive at reasonable conclusions. I don't think there was a miscommunication, I said. Caleb was quite clear. Caleb is a lawyer. He said it with a lightness that was meant to sound dismissive but came out edged. He reads documents. He doesn't know what Grandma actually wanted. She left a recording, Derek. Silence. She left a recording, I said again, and a 40-page trust, and 3 legal advisors who signed off on it. If that's not clear communication, I don't know what is. His voice shifted, just slightly. The warmth dropped another degree. I think we should be careful about how adversarial we let this become. I'm not trying to fight you. I know, I said. You're trying to negotiate. Another pause. Longer, this time. I'll come by the house, he said. Call ahead, I said, and hung up. I set the phone down on the counter and realized my hand was shaking, not from fear, from the particular exertion of holding a line with someone who has spent your entire relationship assuming you won't. He came on Friday. He drove himself, which was unusual. No Kyle, no assistant, no buffer. He was wearing a jacket and no tie, which was his version of casual, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm that he set on the kitchen table when I showed him in. He looked around the house with a kind of measured assessment, the way he would look at a property he was considering acquiring. I did not offer coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He opened the portfolio and produced a document. Clean, formal, probably drafted by whatever attorney he'd put on retainer within 48 hours of the will reading. This is a proposal, he said. Simple. You transfer the house to Vale Industrial as a corporate asset. We'd compensate you fairly, market rate plus 20%, which is generous, and in exchange, the conditions in the will are dissolved. We restructure the trust. Clean slate. I looked at the document without picking it up. The trust can't be restructured without Caleb's firm's involvement and a court review. That can be arranged. And Marion's conditions? He met my eyes. Grandma's gone. What she wanted isn't what's best for the company going forward. I respect her legacy. I intend to honor it in spirit. In spirit. What does that mean? It means I'm going to run the company well. I'm going to make it successful. I'm going to grow it in ways she never could because she was too conservative, too attached to the way things had always been done. That's honoring her legacy, building on it, not being trapped by it. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. He was 31 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his grandmother's jaw and his father's particular talent for making self-interest sound like vision. The employees, I said. The ones in the original conditions, you'd let them go? I'd restructure. Some positions would be consolidated. How many people? A slight tightening around his eyes. Evelyn. How many people? Derek? Preliminary estimates suggest we could optimize by reducing the workforce by about 30% over 18 months. That's over 400 people. With severance packages and placement assistance, 400 people. I let that sit on the table between us. Some of those families have been with this company for 2 generations. Ruth Chen's father worked for your grandmother for 30 years. Do you know that? Ruth Chen no longer works for the company, he said. His voice was flat now. The warmth was entirely gone. I made that call last week. I stared at him. She was obstructionist, he said. She kept referencing my grandmother's directives in every meeting. I don't need someone in that role who can't move forward. You fired Ruth Chen. I restructured her position. She's 63 years old. She'll have a full severance package. He looked at me levelly. This is how companies work, Mom. This is what running a business looks like. I know you worked here in some capacity years ago, but I want to be honest with you. The landscape has changed. The decisions I need to make are going to be uncomfortable sometimes. I need to know the house isn't going to be used as a weapon against me every time I make a call you don't like. There it was. Underneath the portfolio and the carefully drafted proposal, that was the actual sentence, the one that had brought him to this kitchen. He needed the house neutralized. He needed the conditions defanged. And he needed me to do it quietly and willingly, because the alternative A legal battle, a board inquiry, a public dispute was messy and slow and would cost him the kind of clean authority he had already started projecting to investors. I understood all of that clearly. I also understood that Ruth Chen, 22 years, never a single formal complaint, a person who had known Marion long enough to call her by her first name, had been walked out of a building she'd helped build, probably by someone half her age with a clipboard, because she'd made my son feel questioned. "No," I said. He blinked. "No? No, I'm not signing anything. I'm not transferring the house. I'm not helping you dissolve the conditions." I kept my voice very even. I had been practicing this, not the words exactly, but the tone, the not flinching. "And I think you should know that I've been going through the documents Marion left in the house, and there are things in them that you're going to want to understand before you make any more moves." His expression changed then, for just a moment, a flash of something that might have been uncertainty, or might have been calculation, or both, before it settled back into that particular blankness that he deployed when he was working something out internally. "What documents?" he said. "Call Caleb," I said. "Have him explain the full trust structure to you, not the summary, the full document." I stood up. "I think you've been operating under the assumption that the conditions are a formality, something to be managed around. I want you to understand they aren't." He stood too. He picked up the portfolio. The proposal was still on the table. He left it there, which told me he'd expected me to reconsider, or had at least considered that possibility worth leaving open. At the back door, he paused. "You know what's interesting?" he said, his voice back to that careful evenness. "All these years, you talked about wanting a relationship, wanting me to come around more, call more, be present. And now that I'm here, now that I'm trying to have a real conversation with you about something that matters, you're the one stonewalling." It was a good move, I'll give him that. He'd been sitting on it the whole conversation, saving it for the exit, the parting shot designed to follow me through the rest of the day, to make me question whether I was being reasonable, whether I was the one creating the conflict, whether my refusal was really just stubbornness dressed up as principle. I had spent years being susceptible to exactly that kind of move. "The difference," I said, "between a relationship and a negotiation is that one of them requires honesty." I held the door. "Drive safe." He left without looking back. I closed the door, went to the kitchen sink, and ran cold water over my wrists until my hands stopped shaking. Then I picked up the phone and called Caleb. "He fired Ruth Chen," I said, when Caleb answered. A pause on the other end. "When?" "Last week, apparently. He called it restructuring." Caleb was quiet for a moment. I could hear him thinking, the particular quality of silence that comes before a lawyer speaks carefully. "That may constitute a violation of the workforce condition," he said, "depending on how the courts would interpret a senior management termination within the first 30 days. Can we move on it?" "Not yet. One termination, even of someone at Ruth's level, would be difficult to establish as a pattern. The conditions have a 30-day window built in for routine personnel decisions. Marion anticipated this." Another pause. "He'll need to do more, and based on what you're describing, I suspect he will." "He came to buy the house." "I expected he would." "Caleb?" I leaned against the counter. "Did you know? About the patents? About all of it?" "Yes." "How long?" "Marion began restructuring the trust documentation about 18 months ago. She brought me in fully about a year before she died." His voice was steady, but not cold. There was something underneath it, not sentiment, but the particular weight of someone who had been carrying a secret responsibly. She wanted someone outside the family to hold the full picture. She didn't want it in the house until she was ready. And she was ready? She spent the last 4 months of her life making sure every piece was in place. A short pause. "She talked about you, Evelyn. She talked about whether you were strong enough for this." My throat tightened. "What did she decide?" "She built the whole thing around you," Caleb said. "That's what she decided." I didn't say anything for a moment. "What should I do?" I asked. "Go back to the house," he said. "Keep reading. And let Derek make his next move. He will." He made his next move within 2 weeks. I found out about it not from Derek, not from Caleb, but from Gerald Purcell, the old board member who had touched my arm at the will reading. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the East Wing going through binder number 11. "You need to know something," Gerald said without preamble. He was 81 years old and had never bothered much with social lubrication. "Derek's been meeting with Lachlan Group." I put the binder down. Lachlan Group was an acquisition firm. They had made an offer for Vale Industrial in 2007 that Marion had rejected so decisively that the head of the firm reportedly never mentioned the company again in her presence. "He's in discussions," Gerald said. "Not a formal offer yet, but he's had 3 meetings. Their people were in the building last Thursday." "That violates the condition," I said. "The workforce, the assets." He's being careful about the language. He's framing it as a partnership discussion, not a sale. But I've been in this business long enough to know what Lachlan wants, and it's not a partnership. Gerald's voice was dry and tired and angry in the way of someone who had seen too many variations of the same betrayal. "Your grandmother would have thrown him out of that office by his collar." "I know," I said. "He also stopped the community supplier payments, the ones Marion committed to. The smaller fabricators in Greer, the 2 minority-owned shops she'd been supporting for 15 years. Kyle sent them letters last week citing a review of outstanding obligations." I closed my eyes. "He's moving fast," Gerald said. "Faster than I expected." "He thinks the conditions are manageable," I said. "He thinks if he goes fast enough and frames everything carefully enough, by the time anyone can demonstrate a pattern, he'll have enough control locked in that the reversal clause won't matter." "Is he right?" I thought about the laptop in the third room, the 17 files, the 83 pages of trust document with Marion's yellow highlighting and the patent registrations tied to this house and the letter in her handwriting that I had read enough times now that I could hear her voice saying the words. "No," I said. "He's not right." Gerald made a sound, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Call me when you need the board." "I'll need time." "You have some." "Not much." He paused. "Your mother was a very thorough woman." "I'm starting to understand that," I said. That night I went through the remaining files. All of them. I made notes in a spiral notebook I'd found in the kitchen drawer, the kind with the cardboard cover, the kind you buy at a pharmacy, nothing like the leather-bound journals people imagine for scenes like this. My handwriting got messier as the night went on. I ran out of coffee and drank water and kept going. By 3 in the morning, I had a picture of what Marion had built, and it was not the picture I'd been carrying in my head for the last month, or the last decade, or really my entire adult life. I had spent years believing, quietly, in the back of my mind, in the place where you keep the things that hurt too much to examine directly, that my mother had not chosen me, that she had looked at her empire and her grandson and her legacy and decided, for whatever reason she'd never fully explained to me, that I was not the one. That I was the daughter who was loved but not trusted, kept close but not elevated, present but somehow not chosen. I had lived with that belief for so long that I had stopped questioning it. I had simply built my life around the shape of it, smaller, more careful, more braced for disappointment than I should have been. And now I was sitting in the house she had left me at 3 in the morning with her handwriting in my lap and her patents in the cabinet and her plan unfolding page by page, and the belief I'd built my life around was disintegrating like paper in water. She had chosen me. She had chosen me so carefully, so completely, so far in advance, that the choosing itself had been invisible until the moment it was meant to be seen. I thought about Derek, across town, in whatever meeting or dinner or calculation he was currently running. I thought about the letter on Kyle's desk, going to the suppliers in Greer who had counted on those payments. I thought about Ruth Chen, who had spent 22 years of her life in that building and who had been walked out because she'd mentioned my grandmother's name one too many times. I thought about what Marion had written. Love is not the same as permission. And I thought about what it meant to stop protecting someone from consequences, because that was the question, underneath all the legal architecture, underneath the trust documents and the patent registrations and the conditions. That was what Marion had really left me, not a decision already made, a decision to make. She had given me the mechanism. She had given me the proof. She had given me the path. But she had also given me the choice. Because she had known, better than anyone, that I was someone who might still find a way to fold. Who might look at my son, this man I had loved since the moment he existed, this person I had raised and worried over and mourned the distance of for years, and find some last remaining reason to step back. She had trusted me to be better than that instinct. I sat in the old house, in the quiet, with the oak tree barely visible through the dark window, and I decided she was right to. I was not going to fold. I was going to wait one more time, not out of weakness and not to protect him. I was going to wait because Marion's plan required him to finish making his choices first, and because the kind of accountability she had built deserved to land at the right moment, with the right weight, in front of the right people. I was going to let him keep going, and then I was going to let the house speak. The thing about waiting is that it has a cost nobody warns you about. It's not passive. It doesn't feel like patience from the inside. It feels like holding something heavy at arm's length and being told not to put it down yet. Every morning, I woke up in the old house, made coffee, opened the laptop, checked the news alerts I had set up for Vale Industrial, and felt the weight of what I knew pressing against the back of my sternum like a fist. I had the documents. I had the trust. I had the patents and the ledgers, and my mother's letter and 17 files on a laptop that Derek didn't know existed, on a property he'd already started referring to in investor calls. Gerald told me this, as the legacy asset under review. Under review. My mother's house. The house where I'd learned to walk, where she'd sat up with me through 3 childhood fevers, where she'd stood at the kitchen window for 40 years watching the oak tree change seasons. Under review. I kept waiting. Caleb had said I had some time, not much. What I hadn't anticipated was how much would happen in that not much. It started with the suppliers. The 2 small fabricating shops in Greer that Marion had supported, one of them, Alderman Steel, had been founded by a man named Thomas Alderman, who had worked Marion's floor for 15 years before she helped him get his own operation started. The other, a minority-owned shop called Precision Alliance, had been one of her community commitments since 2008, a promise she'd made publicly at a town hall during the recession when she stood up in front of 400 frightened workers and said, "We will not abandon this town." Both shops had contracts with Vale Industrial. Both had received the letters from Kyle last week, informing them that outstanding payments were under review pending a comprehensive audit. Thomas Alderman called me because he didn't know who else to call. "I've got 6 employees," he said. He had a low, careful voice, the voice of a man used to being precise. "I've got a payroll on Friday. The Vale payment was supposed to clear Monday. It didn't." I was standing in the East Wing with binder number 14 open in front of me. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Is there something happening at the company?" "Yes," I said. "There's something happening. I can't tell you everything yet, but I want you to know I'm aware of it, and I want you to hold on a little longer if you can." A long silence. "How much longer?" 2 weeks? Maybe 3. Another silence. I could hear him breathing, the careful breath of a man calculating whether he could afford to trust me. "Your mother was good to me," he finally said. "I'm going to take that on faith." I thanked him. I hung up. Then I sat down on the edge of the filing cabinet and stared at the floor for a while. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I had said it with more confidence than I felt. The second thing that happened was the press release. Derek issued it on a Thursday morning, and I found out about it from an alert on my phone before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Vale Industrial was announcing a strategic realignment. That was the phrase, strategic realignment, which included a review of all legacy operational commitments, a reduction of the non-core workforce by 25% over 12 months, and the initiation of a partnership evaluation with Laughlin Group. Partnership evaluation, not a sale, carefully worded. But Laughlin Group's name was in the press release, and anyone who knew anything about Laughlin Group knew what partnership evaluation meant. It meant they were circling. It meant the door was open. It meant that the company Marion Vale had built from $11,000 and the stubbornness of a 26-year-old widow was being pointed at an exit. My phone started ringing within minutes of the alert. Gerald Purcell. 3 other board members I didn't know well, but who had been with the company long enough to be alarmed. A reporter from the Greer Gazette, who had covered Vale Industrial for 20 years and wanted a comment from the family. I didn't answer any of them. Not yet. I called Caleb. I saw it, he said before I could speak. Is this enough? The supplier payments were already enough, he said. The workforce announcement strengthens it significantly. The Lachlan Group mention. He paused, and I heard something shift in his voice, a kind of controlled sharpness. That's the clearest violation yet. Marion's trust conditions specifically prohibit initiating acquisition discussions without board approval and trustee notification. He didn't notify the trustee. You're the trustee. I am. Did he contact you? No. I held the phone and looked out the window at the oak tree. The May leaves had deepened into full summer green. How fast can we move? The mechanism is ready, Caleb said. It has been for weeks. I've been waiting for the pattern to be clear enough that it can't be contested. I think we're there. A pause. But Evelyn, are you ready? Because once we trigger this, it's not reversible. There's no quiet version of what happens next. I thought about Thomas Alderman and his 6 employees and his Friday payroll. I thought about Ruth Chen being walked out of a building she'd helped run for 22 years. I thought about 400 people who were about to get letters from Kyle informing them that their positions were under review. I thought about Lachlan Group and what they did to companies once they got inside them. I'm ready, I said. Then come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything from the house. Well, I spent that night packing the documents. Not all of them. The binder stayed, the filing cabinet stayed, the laptop stayed. But I gathered the specific documents Caleb had listed in the instructions he'd emailed me that afternoon. The trust instrument with all exhibits, the patent registration files, the original land deeds for the Callaway Road property going back to 1931, and 2 items Marion had specifically indicated were to be held until needed. The first was a sealed USB drive with a label in her handwriting, board meeting, play when ready. The second was a notarized document, a single page signed by Marion, witnessed by Caleb and 2 others, dated 11 months before her death. I read the title at the top of the page and had to set it down for a moment. It was a pre-executed resolution, signed by Marion in her capacity as founding trustee, designating me, Evelyn Marie Vale, as successor trustee and operational director of Vale Industrial Holdings, effective upon fulfillment of the reversal condition. She hadn't just left me the mechanism. She had signed the transfer before she died. She had made the decision already. She had just needed the conditions to catch up. I packed that document last, put it in its own envelope, and held it against my chest for a moment like I was trying to feel the weight of it. Then I put it in the bag with the rest, went to the kitchen, and ate a piece of toast standing at the counter because I hadn't eaten a real meal in about 36 hours, and my hands needed something to do. Then I heard the car in the driveway. Not a quiet car, the kind of car that announces itself. Expensive engine, gravel displaced with confidence. I went to the front window and looked out. It was Derek's car, but Derek wasn't in it. Kyle got out of the passenger side. The driver, a man I didn't recognize, heavy-set, wearing a jacket that had the too deliberate look of someone trying not to look official, got out and stood by the hood. Kyle walked to the front door and knocked. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I opened the door. Kyle looked uncomfortable, which meant he was probably only slightly complicit in whatever this was. Mrs. Vale, I'm sorry to come by so late. Derek asked me to deliver a letter. He held out an envelope. I took it. Who's the man by the car? I asked. Kyle hesitated. He's a property assessor. Derek wanted... He asked him to have a look at the exterior of the property for the purposes of... Kyle, I said. This is private property. It is not a Vale industrial asset. No one has my permission to assess anything about it. Kyle's jaw tightened slightly. I understand. I'll let him know. You can both leave now, I said. Please tell Derek that if he wants to communicate with me about this property, he can have Caleb contact my attorney. Kyle blinked. You have an attorney? I do now, I said, which was only mostly true. I had Caleb, and I had a clear picture of what I needed, and I had made one call to a litigator Caleb had recommended whose name I'd written in my spiral notebook. That was close enough to an attorney for the purposes of this doorstep. I closed the door before Kyle could respond. I opened the envelope. It was not long. 2 paragraphs, printed on Vale industrial letterhead, which told me it was not a personal communication, but a formal one, which told me Derek had also made some calls. The first paragraph was a formal notification that Vale Industrial was initiating an inquiry into the property records associated with 412 Callaway Road, specifically regarding the chain of title on several patent registrations, with the intent of establishing that said patents were properly corporate assets and should not be considered personal property of any individual heir. The second paragraph was a single sentence. We hope this matter can be resolved cooperatively. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, went back to the window. He knew about the patents, not all of it. I was fairly sure he didn't know the full scope of what was in the third room, but he'd figured out enough to understand that the house was strategically important, not just sentimentally. Either someone had talked, or he'd done his own digging, or, and this seemed most likely, he'd had the company's legal team review the patent records and they'd found the Callaway Road address registered as the controlling location. He was trying to claim them. He was trying to make the legal argument that the patents belonged to the company regardless of what the registration showed, and he was trying to do it before I had a chance to formalize anything. It was smart. I won't pretend it wasn't. He had moved faster than I'd given him credit for. I called Caleb at 10:45 at night. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. He knows about the patents, I said. I expected he'd find out eventually. He sent an assessor to the house tonight. A pause that contained a very specific kind of anger, the kind that lawyers keep carefully below the surface. He sent someone to the property. Just to look at the exterior, Kyle said. That's a violation of the property boundary provisions in the trust, Caleb said, his voice gone very controlled. He is not permitted to conduct any activity on or regarding that property without trustee notification and consent. I know. I turned them away. Good. The pause again. Evelyn, I'm moving the meeting up. Can you be at my office tomorrow at 8 instead of 9? Yes. Bring everything, and don't let anyone near that property tonight. I told him I wouldn't. I hung up. I checked every lock in the house, all 6 exterior doors, the old storm cellar latch that hadn't been fully secured since 1997, the window latches in the east wing. Then I sat down in the kitchen with the letter on the table and the document bag at my feet and waited for morning the way you wait in a hospital. Not restfully, just determinedly. Caleb's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled like recycled air and old money. His conference room had a view of the river that I'd never paid much attention to before. I paid attention to it that morning, the gray-green of it, the barges moving slow in the early light, because it gave me somewhere to look while he went through the documents. He read carefully. He asked 3 questions, which I answered. He made notes on a legal pad in handwriting smaller and neater than anyone's had a right to be. When he finished, he set his pen down and looked at me. The patent situation is actually to our advantage, he said. I know it doesn't feel that way, but his inquiry activates a clause in the trust that accelerates the timeline for the reversal review. By initiating a formal property claim, he's essentially triggered the audit mechanism that Marion built in for exactly this scenario. I stared at him. She anticipated him doing this. She anticipated every major move he might make, Caleb said, with a flatness that was almost admiring. The patent inquiry triggers a mandatory independent audit of all corporate actions since the inheritance date. That audit will capture the supplier payments, the Ruth Chen termination, the Lachlan Group discussions, and the workforce announcement. All of it goes into one documented record. And then? And then I convene an emergency board meeting as trustee, at which point I present the audit findings, the trust conditions, and the evidence of violation. He paused. And the pre-executed resolution. I nodded. There's one more thing, Caleb said. He opened a separate folder. Derek's attorney contacted me this morning. They're filing for an emergency injunction to freeze the reversal clause pending a contested trust review. My stomach dropped. Can they do that? They can file it. Whether a judge grants it depends on how quickly we move and how clearly we can establish the violation pattern. He looked at me steadily. This is the window, Evelyn. The injunction filing gives us maybe 72 hours before a temporary stay could be in place. We need to convene the board before that happens. How soon can you schedule it? I've already started making calls. He checked his watch. I'm requesting an emergency session for Monday morning, 48 hours from now. Will the board show up? Gerald Purcell has already confirmed. I have 3 others. I need 5 for a quorum. He paused. And I need you to be in that room. I thought about the boardroom at Vale Industrial. I had been in it perhaps a handful of times over the years. For ceremonial events, for the occasional family presentation Marion had included me in. I had never sat at that table as anything other than the founder's daughter, the person adjacent to power. What do I say? I asked. Caleb picked up the USB drive from the table, Marion's handwriting on the label. Board meeting. Play when ready. You won't need to say much, he said. She already said it. I'm going to tell you something about those 48 hours that I've never told anyone, because this story isn't just about documents and legal mechanisms and the architecture of my mother's plan. It's also about what it costs to finally stop protecting the person who keeps hurting you, because that's what I'd been doing for years. Protecting Derek? Not the way you protect a child from danger, more the way you protect someone from the full weight of who they've become. Every time he did something that crossed a line, I found a reason it wasn't quite as bad as it looked. Every time he said something contemptuous, I told myself he was stressed, or that I had misunderstood the tone, or that the distance between us was partly my fault, something I should have handled differently years ago when he was young enough to still be shaped. I had a therapist years back who told me that this kind of thing, protecting someone from consequences, feels like love from the inside. And she was right. It felt like love. It felt like the minimum decent thing a mother could do. But what it actually was, she said, was a way of keeping things stable at the cost of keeping things honest. A bargain I'd made with myself. I'll absorb the impact of who he is so I don't have to face what it means that I raised him. Sitting in Caleb's office with that USB drive on the table, I was finally fully facing it. My son had fired a 63-year-old woman who had done nothing wrong. He had stopped payments to suppliers who depended on them to pay their people. He had opened a company built on a promise of stability to an acquisition firm whose business model was stripping assets and walking away. He had sent someone to appraise my mother's house, 4 days after she was buried, in effect, like it was inventory to be managed. And I had spent 30 years making excuses for who he was becoming. I thought about Marion's letter. I gave him chances because I loved him. But love is not the same as permission. She'd had to learn that. I had to learn it too. And the learning of it was not a clean, triumphant feeling. It was grief layered on top of anger, layered on top of something old and tired that I didn't have a word for. The end of something I'd been hoping would turn out differently. He wasn't going to turn out differently, not on his own, not without consequences that had real weight. That was the thing I had to accept in those 48 hours. And it was harder than any document in that filing cabinet. He called on Sunday, the day before the board meeting. I had half expected Kyle, or the attorney. I hadn't expected Derek himself. His voice on the phone was different from any register I'd heard from him recently. Not the warm, calculated tone from the kitchen visit, not the flat boardroom control. There was something underneath it that I recognized from a long time ago, from the few times in his life when something had genuinely frightened him. "Mom," he said, "I know about the board meeting. I was in the kitchen of the old house. I didn't sit down." "Okay." Caleb doesn't have the authority to convene that without my consent as current director. "You should take that up with your attorney," I said, "and then have your attorney check the trust bylaws under Section 7, which Caleb tells me specifically grants the trustee independent convening authority in the event of a condition violation review." A silence. "You've been talking to Caleb." "He represents the trust," I said. "Yes." This is a short, controlled exhale. "Mom, I need you to listen to me. What you're doing, what Caleb is doing, it's going to damage the company. Real damage, investor confidence, the Lachlan discussions, the realignment plan. All of it gets thrown into uncertainty. Hundreds of millions of dollars of value is at risk. The workers you were planning to lay off would probably find the framing of that interesting, I said. That's not fair. Thomas Alderman couldn't make payroll last week, Derek. 6 people. He had to call me. The supplier audit was a message, I said. Not an audit. You know that. I paused. And you fired Ruth Chen. He didn't say anything. She worked for your grandmother for 22 years. She knew the company's bones. She was exactly the kind of person you should have been going to for guidance. And you showed her out because she referenced your grandmother's directives. My voice was staying even. I was impressed with myself distantly. That's not strategy, Derek. That's just contempt. You don't understand how companies work. Don't. The word came out hard and flat. Don't say that to me. I was on that floor before you were born. I know how it works. Another silence. Longer. When he spoke again, the register had changed again. Something I hadn't heard in so long that it took me a moment to identify it. Something younger. Mom, I'm not trying to destroy it. I'm trying to grow it. I have plans, real plans. Lachlan isn't an exit. It's leverage for expansion. The workforce changes are about efficiency, not cruelty. I know how it looks, but it's not. He stopped. A breath. I just need you to not do this. Not tomorrow. Give me time to show you what I'm building. There it was, the appeal, the one I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, because it was the version of my son that I had always, in spite of everything, wanted to believe existed. The one who was maybe in over his head, maybe scared, maybe not as irredeemable as the evidence suggested. Maybe. I had answered maybe my whole life where he was concerned. Derek, I said, when your grandmother was dying, you came 4 times in 3 months. The last time you made a phone call from the hallway while she was in the next room. A business call. I stopped, not for effect, but because I needed a second. I'm not telling you that to hurt you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something. She knew you were going to do what you've done. She built all of this because she knew, and she still left you a chance to not do it. Quiet. You made your choices, I said. They weren't small ones. And I'm done being the person who absorbs them for you. His voice, when it came, was stripped of everything. The warmth, the control, the calculation. Just flat and young and something close to lost. So that's it? You're just going to take everything? I'm going to do what your grandmother asked me to do, I said. What happens to you afterward depends entirely on you. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a full minute without moving. Then I went to the window, looked out at the oak tree in the last of the evening light, and let myself feel all of it. The grief, the exhaustion, the fierce and aching love for someone who had made himself very difficult to love well. I felt it. And then I put it somewhere I could carry it without being carried by it. Tomorrow was Monday. I arrived at the Vale Industrial Building at 7:45. The board meeting was scheduled for 9. The building's lobby security guard, a man named Pete, who had worked the morning shift for 11 years and who had always greeted me by name when I visited Marion, looked up when I walked in and then immediately looked uncertain, the way people do when they're not sure who you are in the current version of a situation. Mrs. Vale, he said carefully. Good morning, Pete. I kept walking toward the elevators. Caleb was already in the conference room on the 4th floor, not the executive floor, not Derek's territory, but the board's own conference room, which operated under different access protocols that Derek, apparently, had not yet thought to review. Smart of Caleb to choose it. Gerald Purcell was there. So were 3 other board members I knew by sight, if not well by name. Patricia Marsh, who had been on the board for 12 years and had the particular stillness of someone who rarely spoke but was always listening. Jim Beaumont, who was 68, an engineer by background, and had been one of Marion's early hires when she was still running the original shop, and a younger member named David Seo, who had joined 2 years ago and who was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking like a man in the middle of a decision he hadn't fully anticipated making. 5 board members. Enough for a quorum. I sat down. Caleb set the document folder in front of him and placed the USB drive to his right. I put my bag on the floor and folded my hands and breathed. At 8:52, the conference room door opened. Derek walked in. He was alone. No Kyle. No attorney. He was wearing the same suit as the kitchen visit, the good one, the deliberate one, and his face was composed, but there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. He looked at the room. He looked at the board members. His eyes landed on me for just a moment and then moved to Caleb. "This meeting is not properly convened," he said. His voice was boardroom smooth, impressive, given the phone call 14 hours ago. "I'm filing for a stay with Judge Harmon's clerk this morning. I'd encourage everyone to—" "The filing was denied," Caleb said. The room went very still. "At 7:15 this morning," Caleb continued without inflection, "Judge Harmon reviewed the trust instrument and declined to grant a temporary stay pending review. The independent trustee's authority to convene is upheld." He looked at Derek steadily. "You're welcome to stay for the meeting. You're not required to." Derek stood in the doorway. His jaw moved just slightly before he got it back under control. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down at the far end of the table. Caleb opened his folder. "This emergency session of the Vale Industrial Board," he said, "has been convened under trustee authority to review evidence of potential condition violations in the founding trust established by Marion Eloise Vale, and to consider the implications of those violations for the current governance structure of Vale Industrial Holdings." Gerald Purcell was watching Derek with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. Patricia Marsh had a legal pad in front of her. She had already written 3 lines on it. Jim Beaumont was looking at the USB drive on the table. I was looking at my son. And my son, for the first time since that mahogany table and that terrible laugh, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, looked like someone who understood that what was coming could not be negotiated around. Caleb reached for the USB drive. "Mrs. Marion Vale left a final communication," he said, "to be played at this meeting. She requested that it be heard in full before any discussion takes place." He pressed play. And my mother's voice came into the room for the second time. Only this time, it was not the warm, reasoned, measured voice from the will reading. This was something different. This was Marion Vale at her most precise, her most unflinching. The voice she had used for 40 years in rooms where things needed to be said clearly and without apology. And I sat at that table and listened, and every word landed like something I'd been waiting my whole life to hear said out loud. The recording began without preamble, the way Marion did everything. She was sitting in the 3rd room of the East Wing. I recognized the shelving units behind her, the flat filing cabinet at the edge of the frame. And she looked, in the recording, the way she had looked in the last months of her life. Thinner than she should have been, with that particular stillness of someone who had made peace with a timeline they couldn't control. But her eyes were clear. Completely clear. The kind of clear that comes not from certainty about the future, but from certainty about yourself. She looked directly into the camera. "If this recording is being played," she said, "then the conditions have been violated, and Derek is in that room." At the far end of the table, my son went very still. "I want to speak to the board first," Marion continued, "because what I'm about to say is relevant to every person in that room who has a fiduciary responsibility to this company. I have been watching Vale Industrial for 42 years. I have been watching my grandson for 3. And I want to be precise about what I've observed, because precision matters when you're talking about the future of something you built with your hands." She paused. Not for drama, just to breathe. "Derek Vale is intelligent. He is charming. He has a genuine facility for relationships at the surface level, which is a real asset in business when it is paired with integrity. But what I have documented, what this firm has documented, what the audit you are about to review will demonstrate, is that he has used those gifts consistently and deliberately in the service of his own advancement, at the expense of the people and commitments this company was built on." Patricia Marsh's pen was moving on her legal pad. "I am not saying this to punish him," Marion said. "I am saying it because the board deserves to understand what has been happening inside this company, and because the record needs to be clear before any decisions are made." She looked into the camera with that particular directness that had always made her hard to look away from. "I am also saying it to him, directly, because I did not say it clearly enough while I was alive, and that is one of my few genuine regrets." She shifted slightly in her chair, The camera caught the way her hands were folded in her lap. Steady, deliberate. Derek, you laughed at your mother at the reading of my will. I was told you would. I knew you would, because you have spent your adult life looking at Evelyn and seeing someone less than you, someone who didn't win. I need you to sit in that room and understand something that I should have said to you at 25 and at 28, and every time you spoke about her with that particular dismissiveness, I watched you practice until it became habit. The room was absolutely silent. I was not looking at Derek. I was looking at my mother's face on the screen. Your mother built more of this company than you will ever understand because she did it without title and without credit and without ever once asking me to acknowledge it publicly. She was on this floor when the furnaces went down in 2009. She was in the community meetings when we almost lost the Greer contract. She was in the hospital waiting room when Jim Beaumont had his bypass, and nobody thought to call family. And she sat there for 6 hours because she understood that being part of something means showing up when it's inconvenient. A pause. You have never done that, not once. And it was not because you didn't know how. It was because you decided it wasn't worth your time. Jim Beaumont, at the table, let out a slow breath. I saw him press his lips together. I am not leaving you with nothing, Marion said. I want that to be clear. The conditions I set were not a trap designed to take everything from you. They were a structure, a real one, with real accountability, designed to give you the chance to become something better than what you had chosen to be. You chose not to use that chance. You chose to move fast, cut corners, and dismiss the obligations I left you as obstacles. Her voice didn't harden. It stayed even, which was somehow worse. That is a choice. And choices have weight. She looked into the camera one final time. The pre-executed resolution is in Caleb's possession. It is valid. It is final. Evelyn is the rightful steward of Vale Industrial, and she has been for a long time. I simply waited until the moment was right to say so in a way that could not be undone. A pause. I love you, Derek. That is the truth. But love without accountability is just permission, and I am done giving you permission to harm what I built. The recording ended. The silence that followed was the loudest I have ever experienced in an enclosed room. It was the silence of 7 people sitting with the weight of something that had just landed and could not be taken back. I looked at my son. He was sitting at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the wood surface, not moving. His face was, and I say this not with satisfaction, but with the complicated grief of someone who knows a person well enough to read them, undone. Not angry, not calculating, just undone. Like a man who had walked into a room expecting to negotiate and found that the negotiation had happened without him, years ago, in a room he'd never been invited into. For the first time in a very long time, he looked like the boy he had been before he decided that looking like anything was a vulnerability. Caleb spoke first, quietly, and with precision. He walked the board through the audit findings, 12 pages of documented violations, beginning with the Ruth Chen termination and moving through the supplier payment suspension, the workforce announcement, the Lachlan group meetings, and the patent inquiry. He explained the trust conditions. He explained the reversal clause. He presented the pre-executed resolution and explained its legal standing, which was, he said, unambiguous. Patricia Marsh asked 2 questions. Gerald Purcell asked none. Jim Beaumont sat with his arms folded and his eyes on the table and said nothing until Caleb finished, at which point he said, "How soon can the transition be formalized?" "Within 48 hours, Caleb said, assuming board approval of the trustees' recommendation. "Then let's vote," Gerald said. Derek's attorney, who had apparently arrived at some point during the recording and was sitting against the wall rather than at the table, which told me he understood the room, leaned forward and said something quietly to Derek. Derek shook his head once. The attorney sat back. "Is there any statement from the current director before the vote?" Caleb asked. Professional, neutral, offering the procedural courtesy. Derek looked up. He looked at the board members. He looked at Caleb. And then he looked at me. A long look, the longest he'd held my eyes in years. And I looked back. And I didn't look away. And I didn't make the look mean anything that it didn't have to mean. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't cold. I was just there, the way I had always been there, waiting for him to see me clearly. He looked away first. No statement, he said. The vote was 5-0. I'm not going to pretend that the moment the vote was recorded felt like victory. That's not what it felt like. It felt like the end of something long and exhausting and sad. The end of a version of my family that had never quite worked the way I'd wanted it to, and the beginning of something I didn't yet have a clear shape for. What I remember most about the 20 minutes after the vote is the small things. Caleb's hand briefly on my arm as he walked past. Gerald Purcell saying, very quietly, "She'd be pleased," and me not being entirely sure whether he meant Marion or me. David Seo, the youngest board member, standing at the window looking out at the river with his hands in his pockets, like a man recalibrating. Jim Beaumont saying to no one in particular, "Well, now we get to work." Derek left before I could say anything to him. His attorney collected the papers from in front of him and they walked out together. And I heard the elevator open and close, and that was that. I sat at the table for a while after the others drifted out. Just sat. The USB drive was still on the table in front of Caleb's chair. My mother's voice had been in this room not 20 minutes ago, and now the room was quiet, and the river was still moving outside the window, and I was, for the first time in 2 months, not bracing for what came next. I wasn't sure what I felt. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to find the right word. Not relief exactly. Relief has an unclenching to it that I didn't fully feel. Not joy. Not peace. Something more honest than any of those. Something like standing up straight after a very long time of being bent into a shape the situation required. I picked up the USB drive, put it in my bag, stood up. I had work to do. The first thing I did as operational director of Vail Industrial was not glamorous and not symbolic. I drove to Caleb's office, signed the formal transition paperwork, and then I drove to Greer. Thomas Alderman's shop was a modest operation, a steel-sided building off the county road with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a sign that had weathered some winters hard. I pulled in at 2 in the afternoon. He was in the shop, supervising the loading of a small order, and he came out when he heard the car, wiping his hands on a shop rag, squinting against the afternoon light. I told him the payment would clear by end of week. I told him the supplier relationships were reinstated in full. I told him that the community commitment Marion had made in 2008 was not going anywhere. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, once the way people do when they've been holding tension for so long that relief doesn't have a big expression, just a slow release. "Tell me what you need," he said. "From the company going forward, what does Alderman Steele actually need to operate reliably?" He blinked, like nobody had asked him that in a while. "Better lead times on material specs," he said. 30 days instead of 60. And a direct contact at the company. One person I can actually reach when there's an issue. Not a call center. "Done," I said. "I'll have someone call you tomorrow." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a press release. It was just what needed to happen. And I did it. I did the same thing at Precision Alliance. I sat with the owner, a woman named Sandra Lee, for 45 minutes in her small office, and I listened to what the last 3 weeks had cost her operation, and I did not try to minimize it or explain it away. I said, "I know, I'm sorry, it should not have happened." And then I asked what she needed to stabilize, and I wrote it down in my spiral notebook, and I meant it. Driving back from Greer, I thought about Marion doing exactly these things for 40 years. Not with fanfare, just showing up, asking the right questions, following through. The unglamorous daily substance of what she had called legacy, not wealth. Legacy. I was starting to understand the difference. The first 10 days after the transition were the hardest professionally of my life, and I say that as someone who once managed a factory shutdown during a blizzard with a phone that kept dropping signal. The Lachlan Group discussions had to be formally terminated, which required a series of calls to their people that were, to put it charitably, tense. The Lachlan representative, so a man named Griffin, who had the practiced smoothness of someone who had been told no before but never liked it, tried several angles before accepting that the answer was final. "You understand you're leaving significant value on the table," he said. "I understand that's your perspective," I said. "The company is not for sale. There are investors who are going to be unhappy. There are 400 employees who are about to receive layoff notices, I said. I'm more concerned about them. He hung up. The workforce announcement had to be reversed, which meant communicating to 400 people that their jobs were not, in fact, at risk, and doing so without throwing Derek explicitly under a bus, because I had made a decision early on that I was going to handle the transition professionally, regardless of what he had done, both because it was right and because the company didn't need the internal instability of a family war playing out in memos. This was harder than terminating the Lachlan talks, harder than the board meeting, in some ways, because those 400 people had spent 2 weeks living under uncertainty, had been quietly updating resumes, having hard conversations with spouses, calculating whether they could survive on one income for a while, and the relief they felt when the announcement came was mixed, for a lot of them, with a justifiable anger about having been put in that position in the first place. I did something Marian had done in 2009 that I had watched from the back of the room and never forgotten. I went to the factory floor, not with a speech prepared, not with PR. I showed up on a Wednesday morning with Caleb and Gerald, and I walked the floor, and I talked to people, and I listened more than I talked, and I told them the truth, that the decisions of the past 6 weeks did not reflect the company's direction, that the commitments made by Marian Vale were being reinstated in full, and that I was aware they had been frightened, and I thought they deserved to know that directly from me. A floor supervisor named Marcus Webb, who had been with the company for 18 years, whose father had also worked there, who had the kind of hands that tell you everything you need to know about how someone earns their living, stopped me near the end of the walk. "What about Ruth Chen?" he asked, not confrontationally, just steadily. "I've spoken with Ruth," I said. "I've asked her to come back. It's her choice." He nodded. "She'll come back." "I think so too," I said. She did. She took 2 days to think about it and then called me on a Friday morning and said, "I have conditions." I told her to name them. They were entirely reasonable. I agreed to all of them and added one she hadn't asked for, a formal acknowledgement in her personnel file that her termination had been improper and was expunged. "You didn't have to do that last part," she said. "I know," I said, "but it happened, and the record should reflect what actually happened." She was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have done the same thing," she said. I told her that was the point. Derek did not disappear. I want to be clear about that because I think some people, when they hear this story, imagine that he simply walked out of that boardroom and vanished from my life, and the story became clean and resolved. That is not what happened. What happened was messier and slower and more human than that, because that is what real things are like. He contacted me through his attorney first, which was the right approach given the circumstances. There were legal matters to resolve, the formal divestiture of his director status, the documentation of the trust reversal, questions about what remained of his stake in the company as a shareholder, which was a different matter from governance. Caleb and his attorney handled most of it. I was kept informed without having to be in every room. But then, about 3 weeks after the board meeting, Derek called me himself. Not to negotiate, not to contest anything. He called at 7 in the evening, which meant he'd thought about whether to call for at least a few hours, which was unusual for him. He was not a person who second-guessed his own phone calls. "I'm not going to fight it," he said. First thing, before I could say anything. "I know," I said. "I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I heard the recording, what Grandma said." A pause. "I've heard it about 6 times now, actually." I didn't say anything. I let him have the space. "I keep getting stuck on the part where she says I chose to look at you as less than me." His voice was doing something uncomfortable, something he probably hated doing in front of anyone, including me. It was stripped of its usual management layer, the smooth surface he maintained over everything. Because I know she's right. I've known it for a while, I was good at not knowing it, if that makes sense. "It makes sense," I said. And it did. That was the worst part in a way. It made complete sense. "I'm not saying this to get anything," he said quickly, like he'd anticipated my skepticism. "There's nothing left to negotiate. I know that. I think I owe you that much, to say it without wanting something in return." "That's a start," I said. He laughed, just slightly, It was a different laugh from the one in the conference room, something smaller and less defended. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." We talked for 23 minutes. It was not a reconciliation. I want to be precise about that because I think precision matters when you're talking about what can and cannot be repaired quickly. We did not resolve anything fundamental in 23 minutes. We did not arrive at forgiveness or understanding or a new chapter. We just talked. Two people who had a complicated and damaged relationship and who were, for the first time in recent memory, doing so honestly. I told him what I was planning for the company. Not because I needed his input, but because it felt right to tell him. Because some part of me still believed, stubbornly and against significant evidence, that there was a version of him capable of learning something from how Marion had actually built what he'd tried to take. He listened. Actually listened. The way he rarely had. When I told him about the factory floor walk, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did they react? The workers?" "With a lot of wariness," I said, "and some real anger. And then, gradually, something else." "What?" "Relief," I said, "but the kind you have to earn, not the kind you can announce." Another pause. "I didn't know how to do that," he said. "That kind of thing. I didn't think it mattered." "I know," I said. "That's the part she was hoping you'd learn." "And instead, you're the one who's going to learn it," he said. "I already knew it," I said, not unkindly. "I just finally got to use it." He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said he should let me go, and I said good night, and we hung up, and I sat in Marion's kitchen. I was staying at the house most nights now, had been for weeks, and looked at the ceiling for a while. He was not a villain, my son. That would have been simpler. He was a man who had made choices that had caused real harm, and who had been able to make those choices because nobody in his life, including me, had held a firm enough line soon enough. He was what happens when the consequences keep getting absorbed by people who love you until the day they stop. He was also 31 years old, which is old enough to have made the choices he made, and also, maybe, possibly, not certainly, young enough for the weight of them to teach him something. I didn't know which way that would go. I still don't. That's the honest answer. What Marion had written in the letter, not wealth, but legacy. I turned that sentence over in my mind through all of this. While I was on the phone with Lachlan Group, and while I was walking the factory floor, and while I was sitting across from Ruth Chen listening to her conditions, and while I was in Thomas Alderman's parking lot in the afternoon light. Legacy had always sounded like a grand word to me, abstract, the kind of word used in eulogies and annual reports. But in those weeks I started to understand it as something much more specific and much more daily than I had thought. It was Thomas Alderman's 6 employees making payroll. It was Marcus Webb asking about Ruth Chen because he understood that how you treat one person tells the whole floor everything about what kind of place they're working in. It was Jim Beaumont saying, "Now we get to work in a boardroom where something complicated had just ended and something else had to begin." Legacy was not the building or the stock price or the founder's name on the letterhead. It was the choices you made when there was cost to them. Whether you showed up when it was inconvenient, whether you did the thing even when no one important was watching, whether you ran a company like it was a living thing made of people instead of a mechanism to be optimized for personal advantage. Marion had known that. She had built it into the bones of everything she left behind, and she had left it to me. Not because I was perfect. I wasn't. I had my own long list of failures in that regard. But because she believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been right about most things for 40 years, that I would try to honor it for the right reasons. I was going to try. That was the most honest thing I could say about it. About 6 weeks after the board meeting, Gerald Purcell came to find me in my office, the director's office, the one on the executive floor that had been Marion's for 30 years and that I had not yet fully made my own, partly from practical necessity and partly from something more personal that I was still working through. He knocked on the open door and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had something to say and wasn't sure how to start, which was unusual for Gerald, who was not typically a man who hesitated. "Sit down, Gerald," I said. He sat. He looked around the office, the shelves, the desk, the window, and then he looked at me with an expression I recognized, though I hadn't seen it directed at me before. It was the look he had given Marion in board meetings when something had been handled exactly the way it should be. "The Greer suppliers are back on track," he said. "The workforce stabilization is ahead of schedule. Precision Alliance's latest delivery was early, first time in 3 quarters. Ruth Chen tells me the operations team is running at better efficiency than it was 6 months ago." He paused. "You've been busy." "There was a lot to fix," I said. "There was," he agreed. "You fixed it." I looked at him. "What is it you actually came to say, Gerald?" He almost smiled. "I came to say that I've been on this board for a long time, and I've watched a lot of people come into leadership positions, and most of them come in with something to prove. The best ones figure out pretty fast that proving something is the wrong goal." He paused. "You didn't come in with anything to prove. That's unusual." "I came in with a lot of work to do," I said. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." He stood up, got to the door, turned back once. "Your mother used to say," he told me, "that the right person for something is usually the one who didn't spend a lot of time wanting it. They just knew it needed doing." He looked at me steadily. "She was right about that. She was right about most things." "She was," I said. "But don't tell her I said that. She was hard enough to deal with when she was right." He laughed. A real laugh. The kind that tells you someone is actually surprised by their own amusement. And then he walked out, and I heard the elevator open down the hall, and I sat in the chair that had been my mother's for 30 years and looked out the window at the city she had spent her life in, and I breathed. Outside, the afternoon light was changing on the buildings, that particular late summer shift where the gold comes in sideways and makes ordinary things look briefly significant. I watched it for a few minutes, longer than I should have, probably, given everything on my desk. Then I picked up my phone and called Caleb. "The old house," I said. "I want to talk about the renovation." "The renovation?" He sounded careful. "What are you thinking?" Marion's letter mentioned it, her real dream. Not the company, not the wealth, the training center. For the workers' children. I paused. "I want to build it. I want to use the house." A beat of silence. "The east wing could be classrooms," I said. "The main floor, a common space. The yard." I thought about the oak tree, the overgrown rose bushes, the long grass that had finally been cut. "The yard is enormous. There's room for a lot." "Evelyn," Caleb said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard from him before, something warm, underneath the professional even. "She wrote about that in her original trust notes, the training center. She wasn't sure you'd do it." "She should have just asked me," I said. "She didn't want you to do it because she asked," he said. "She wanted you to do it because you saw the reason." I looked out the window. The gold light was still there, catching the edge of the building across the street, turning ordinary brick into something briefly beautiful. "I see the reason," I said. "Then let's build it," he said. "The renovation took 11 months. I want to say that because I think it's important. 11 months of noise and dust and decisions and arguments with contractors and structural surprises that nobody had anticipated, and a heating system that turned out to be more compromised than the inspection had suggested, and a stretch in February where the east wing roof had to be entirely replaced, and I stood in the hallway looking at exposed rafters and thought, not for the first time, that Marion might have overestimated what was possible here. But she hadn't. She never did. The construction crew we hired was local, a firm out of Greer that had done work for Vale Industrial twice before, run by a woman named Deb Coster, who wore steel-toed boots and had opinions about load-bearing walls that turned out to be correct every single time, and who did not soften her estimates to make you feel better about anything. I liked her immediately. She reminded me, in the way she moved through a room, of my mother. Deb had a way of walking through the house at the end of a workday and pointing at things that needed to be fixed that I hadn't noticed yet. She'd stop in a doorway and say something like, "That sill is rotting from the inside. You don't touch it now, you'll be replacing the whole frame by spring." And she'd be right, and it would cost more than expected and take longer than scheduled, and I would adjust the timeline and authorize the work and go home to my apartment. I had stopped sleeping at the house once construction began, for obvious reasons, and lie awake running numbers. I was not, I should be clear, doing this project with unlimited resources. I was doing it with a specific allocation from the company's community investment fund, which Marion had maintained for years, and which I had restored to its original funding level as one of my first acts as director, and with a matching contribution I made personally from what Marion had left me in liquid assets. It was enough. Barely, toward the end, but enough. I tell you about the difficulty of it because I think the difficult parts are the real parts. The version of this story where everything comes together easily after the board meeting, where the documents get signed and the house transforms and the lesson is learned and everyone takes their proper place in the new order, that version would be a lie. The real version had a roof that failed in February and a contractor argument in April and a board member who had doubts about the community center concept that took 3 separate conversations to work through, and a morning in June when I sat on the front steps of the half-renovated house and cried, not from sadness exactly, just from the accumulated weight of all of it finally needing somewhere to go. I sat on those steps for about 15 minutes, then I went back inside. Derek came to the house twice during the renovation. The first time was unannounced, which I had not expected from him, given everything, and I was in the East Wing with Deb going over the classroom conversion plans when Ruth Chen, who had been helping me coordinate the community outreach side of the project on a volunteer basis on her Saturdays, came to find me and said quietly, "Your son is in the driveway." I went out. He was standing at the edge of the gravel, looking at the house with an expression I couldn't immediately read. He was dressed down, jeans, a jacket, no portfolio, no Kyle. He had a paper coffee cup in his hand, and he looked like someone who had driven somewhere without being entirely sure they were going to get out of the car. "I should have called," he said. "You should have," I agreed. "What do you need?" He looked at the house. "I heard you were renovating. I wanted to see it." A pause. "Is that weird?" "A little," I said. "But come in if you want." He followed me inside. I gave him the abbreviated version of the tour. The East Wing with its future classrooms, the main floor being opened up into a common space, the kitchen which was being expanded to serve as a teaching kitchen, the yard where we were planning a small outdoor program area. He was quiet through most of it. He asked one practical question about the HVAC system, and I told him about the February roof situation, and he nodded with the expression of someone absorbing information rather than performing interest. At the doorway of what had been the third room, Marion's command center, which was being converted into a small library and reading space, he stopped. "This is where she recorded it," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He stood there for a moment, just stood, looking at the shelving units that were still there, the walls that Deb's crew hadn't touched yet. "I owe her an apology," he said. "I know she can't hear it." "She knew who you were," I said. "She built a whole structure around who you were. She didn't need the apology." "I know," he said. "I need to give it anyway." I understood that. I left him there for a few minutes and went back to Deb, and when he came out he was composed again, the way he usually was, but there was something slightly different in the set of his face, something that had been loosened a little. At the front door, he paused. "The training center," he said, "for the workers' kids." "How many kids are you expecting?" "First cohort, about 40, I said. "After that, we'll see." He nodded. Was quiet for a moment. "If you need someone to teach a business curriculum, basic finance, entrepreneurship, I'm not saying now, I'm saying eventually, if it would be useful." He met my eyes briefly. "I'm good at the conceptual side, you know that. I just used it wrong." I looked at my son, 31 years old, standing in his grandmother's half-renovated house, making an offer that would cost him something. Not money, but the particular vulnerability of showing up somewhere as a person who had failed visibly and asking to be given something constructive to do. "I'll think about it," I said. And I meant it. That was the honest answer. Not yes, and not yet, but not no either. A door left open at exactly the width it deserved to be open, which was narrow but real. He nodded. "That's fair." He walked to his car, got in, drove out, slower on the gravel than he'd come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then Ruth Chen was behind me, coffee in hand, not saying anything but present in the particular way of someone who has understood something without needing it explained. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, which was true. "I think okay." "Okay is enough," she said. "Come look at the outreach calendar. I have some thoughts about the enrollment criteria." And we went back inside. The second time Derek came was in October, about 3 weeks before the opening. He called ahead this time. He asked if he could bring someone, and I said yes, and he arrived with a woman named Claire who was an architect and who had, as it turned out, a specialty in adaptive reuse of historic residential properties. She walked through the house with the particular attention of someone who saw structures the way most people see faces, reading history in them, understanding what they'd been and what they could become. I hadn't known Derek was seeing her. He hadn't mentioned it. He introduced her with the slightly careful manner of someone not sure how the introduction would land, and I shook her hand and showed her around and decided within about 10 minutes that I liked her, which was complicated and also simple in the way those things usually are. Claire had thoughts about the yard, specifically about the oak tree, which Deb had suggested trimming significantly for practical reasons, and which Claire thought should be preserved as is and built around. "That tree is older than the house," she said, standing in the yard, looking up. "You don't cut that back. You design around it." "That's what I said," I told her. Deb disagreed. "Deb is practical," Claire said, "but some things should be impractical." Derek, standing slightly behind us, said quietly, "The tree stays." I looked at him. He was looking at the oak, at the way the October light came through the thinning leaves, gold and specific and familiar in the way of things you've looked at all your life without knowing you were memorizing them. "The tree stays," I agreed. We had lunch afterward, the three of us, at a diner near the Callaway Road gate, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that arrives before you ask. It was not a smooth or easy lunch. There were awkward moments and silences, and at least one subject change that everyone in the booth understood was deliberate. But it was real. People were present. Nobody was performing. At one point, Claire said something about the history of the house. She had looked it up before coming. And she mentioned the year Marion had bought the property, and Derek said, "She bought it with $30,000 she borrowed from the company in 1973. She paid it back in 2 years." And then he stopped, like he was surprised he knew that. "She told you that?" I asked. "She told me a lot of things," he said. "I wasn't always listening." He looked at his coffee. "I remember more of it now than I thought I did. I didn't say anything. I just let that be what it was." The opening of the Marion Vale Community Learning Center, that was what we named it, after a board vote that was unanimous and slightly emotional, though only Jim Beaumont let it show, happened on a Saturday in November. It was cold. Not brutally cold, but the kind of November cold that makes the sky very blue and very high and puts your breath in front of your face when you talk. The yard had been cleared and strung with lights. The oak tree, which stayed, which will always stay now, had a small brass marker at its base that Caleb had commissioned, which said simply, "This tree was here before any of this. It will be here after." We expected 60 people. We got closer to 120. Workers came with their kids and their spouses and their parents. Thomas Alderman drove up from Greer with his whole shop, 6 people plus families, which was 12 total, filling a cluster of folding chairs near the East Wing entrance. Sandra Lee from Precision Alliance came with her daughter, who was 8 years old, and asked me 3 questions in a row about what kind of things she would learn here, with the focused intensity of a kid who had already decided this was interesting. I answered all 3 questions. The third one was whether there would be books about real animals, not just stories, because she wanted to be a veterinarian. I told her yes, and that we would make sure of it, and I wrote it in my spiral notebook right in front of her because she was watching to see if I would. Ruth Chen ran the registration table at the front door, which I had not asked her to do. She had simply shown up early and organized it, the way she organized everything, without fanfare and with complete competence. Gerald Purcell was there, in a good coat, looking around the yard with the expression of a man who had seen enough of the world to recognize when something was being done right. Marcus Webb, the floor supervisor, came with his wife and 2 daughters. He shook my hand when he arrived and said, "My oldest is thinking about engineering. You have anything for that? I told him we were building a STEM program for the spring and that his daughter should come to the information session we were planning. He nodded, the same single nod as always, and went to get food. Jim Beaumont made a short speech. He had not been asked to, but he was 81 years old and had been with the company since the beginning, and he had something to say, and nobody was going to tell him not to say it. He talked about Marion for about 4 minutes, without notes, in the way of someone who had known her well enough that the memory was still vivid and specific. He talked about a meeting in 1987 where she had turned down a contract worth double what they needed because the buyer had wanted a provision that would have cut the pension. He said, "She put the paper down on the table and she said, 'I don't need their money that badly.' And she didn't. That was the whole thing about her. She never needed anyone's money badly enough to compromise what she'd built." He looked at me at the end. "She'd have found all of this a bit much," he said, "but she'd have been proud. That I can say for certain." I thanked him. My voice held, which surprised me. Caleb was there with his wife, a quiet woman named Anne who had never worked in law and who spent the afternoon talking to workers' spouses with the genuine ease that made me like her immediately. Caleb himself stood at the edge of the yard for much of the afternoon, watching, with the expression of a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had finally set it down. He came to find me near the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned enough to move freely, and the lights in the yard were beginning to matter as the sky darkened. "She would have hated this many people in her house," he said. "I know," I said. "She'd have been standing right where you are, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't pleased." He smiled. "Yes." A pause. "Are you pleased?" I looked around the yard, the lights in the oak tree, Sandra Lee's daughter eating a cookie and talking to one of the construction crew kids, Ruth at the registration table laughing at something with Thomas Alderman. The east wing windows lit from inside, warm yellow against the November blue. "I'm working on it," I said. That was the truth. Not the clean, finished version, but the actual one. I was working on pleased. I was somewhere in the territory of it, moving in its direction, not arrived but not lost either. "That's enough," Caleb said. "That's enough," I agreed. "I need to tell you about Derek at the opening because it is the part of this story I have thought about most often in the time since. He came. He had asked, in a text 2 days before, whether it would be appropriate for him to attend, and I had said yes, come, and I meant it. He arrived about an hour into the event, again without fanfare, with Claire beside him, and they stayed near the back of the yard for most of the afternoon, not drawing attention, not circulating the way you circulate when you want to be seen. Just present. About midway through, he ended up near Thomas Alderman, and I watched from across the yard as they talked. I couldn't hear what was said, but I watched Thomas's face go from the cautious reserve he'd worn since the payment crisis to something more open. And I watched Derek listen in a way that, and I am trying to be precise here, trying not to project, looked different from how he usually listened. Less like someone cataloging information and more like someone actually receiving it. At some point, Thomas said something and Derek nodded, and Thomas clapped him once on the shoulder, but just once, brief, the way men do when they've arrived at some small mutual understanding. And then they both moved on. I don't know what was said. I didn't ask. Some things are better left as what they are, which is private and unverified and therefore possibly better than the reality. Near the end of the afternoon, Derek found me. Claire had gone to look at the East Wing classroom space, and he stood beside me at the edge of the yard, both of us looking at the oak tree, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then he said, "The factory floor." I looked at him. "What?" "You said Grandma put the workers' interests first, that she went to the floor?" He was looking at the tree. "I went, last week. I just walked the floor. I told security I was doing a facility review, which wasn't entirely untrue, but mostly I just wanted to see it." I didn't say anything. "Marcus Webb showed me around," he said. "He didn't have to. He knew who I was, what had happened. He did it anyway." He paused. "He showed me the furnace line, the one from 2009 that Grandma refinanced the house to keep running." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know she refinanced the house. I knew the 2009 story in the abstract. Company survived the recession, kept all its people, But I didn't know she used this house specifically to do it. She didn't talk about it, I said. She didn't think it required talking about. No, he said. She wouldn't. He finally looked at me. I'm going to work on the floor, starting in January. Caleb said it's part of the conditions going forward, the repayment structure, the accountability framework, the whole thing. But I'm not telling you this as a legal obligation. I'm telling you because I think I need to understand what I nearly dismantled. I looked at my son. The November light was low and specific, the kind that shows things plainly. He looked tired in a way that wasn't bad, exactly. The tired of someone who has started carrying something they weren't carrying before. That's going to be hard, I said. I know. Marcus is not going to make it easy for you. Good, he said. He shouldn't. I looked back at the oak tree. The offer you made, about teaching, the business curriculum. He went still slightly, like someone trying not to react too fast to something they've been hoping to hear. Come to the spring information session, I said. Talk to Ruth about what the curriculum needs. If there's a fit, we'll talk about a structure. I paused. But I want to be clear. You're not doing this to rehabilitate your image. You're not doing this to get something. If you walk in that door and I feel like you're performing, I know, he said. I know. Then come to the information session. He nodded. He looked at the yard, the lights, the people, the lights in the east wing, the brass marker at the base of the oak tree. He stood there long enough that I knew he was actually looking, not just waiting to respond. She did all of this for you, he said finally. Everything, the documents, the plan, all of it. She did it because she believed in you. I know, I said. I spent years not seeing that, he said. Not seeing you. He stopped. Tried again. I don't know how to make that right. I don't think there's a transaction for it. There isn't, I said. There's just time. And what you do with it. He stood beside me for a few more minutes. Then Claire came back from the east wing with her coat buttoned and her eyes bright from whatever she'd seen inside. And she said something to Derek about the window placement in the classroom that opened into a conversation about light and space and what children need from a room they're meant to learn in. And I listened to them talk and thought about how strange it is, the way life keeps moving even when you think you've arrived somewhere that should hold still. I go to the house every week now, not to check on it. It runs largely without me on a daily basis, between Ruth's coordination and the staff we've hired and the volunteers who have come forward in numbers that surprised me, though probably shouldn't have. I go because it's mine, and because being there still feels like a conversation with my mother that I'm not done having. I sit sometimes in the kitchen with coffee that is now much better than the stuff she kept in the cupboard, and I look out the window at the oak tree, and I think about all the things I didn't know while she was alive that I know now. The planning, the patience, the 12 years of documenting, waiting, building the architecture of a protection she hoped she'd never have to deploy. And I think about what it would have felt like to tell her while she was alive, not at the end, when she was already going, but years ago, when I was still operating under the belief that she hadn't chosen me. What it would have felt like to know. I think it would have changed things. I think I would have stood up straighter, earlier. I think I would have held lines I softened. I think I would have looked at Derek differently, with less excuse-making and more of the clear-eyed accountability she was practicing herself all along. But she didn't tell me. And I've thought about why, a lot, and I think the answer is this. She needed me to arrive at myself without her hand on my back. She needed the strength I found in those 11 months in the East Wing, and those weeks after the board meeting, and those hard conversations to be mine, fully mine, not borrowed from knowing she was behind me. She needed me to discover that I was capable of what I was capable of, because otherwise I would always be operating from her authority instead of my own. She gave me the tools. She left me to become the person who could use them. That is the most loving thing she ever did for me, and it cost her the chance to see me know it while she was alive. I think about that cost sometimes. I think she calculated it and accepted it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. Marion Vale was not a soft woman, but she was a precise one, and her precision, turned toward love, looked like this. There's one more thing I want to tell you, because this story is not only about inheritance and companies and legal documents and the machinery of consequence, though it is also about all of those things. It is about something older and more stubborn than any of that. 6 months after the opening, I was in the yard on a Saturday morning when a group of kids from the second cohort were doing an outdoor session, some kind of basic engineering project involving PVC pipes, and a lot of arguing about physics, supervised by a young teacher named Kofi, who had the particular patience of someone who actually finds children's arguments about physics interesting. Sandra Lee's daughter, whose name was Amara, was in that group. The one who wanted to be a veterinarian, who had asked me 3 questions at the opening and watched to see if I wrote them down. She came up to me at one point, slightly apart from the group, holding a segment of PVC pipe like a staff. "Are you the one who started this?" she asked. She had the direct conversational style of a child who hasn't learned yet that adults prefer to be approached obliquely. "Mostly, my mother started it," I said. "I finished it." She considered this. "Why didn't she finish it herself?" "She ran out of time," I said. "She got sick." Amara looked at the yard, at the house, at the oak tree. "So you did it for her?" "I did it because she showed me it was worth doing," I said. "That's a little different." She thought about this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to things that deserve it. "My mom says you have to finish things even when they're hard," she said. "Your mom is right," I said. "She's usually right," Amara said, with the air of someone who found this both reassuring and slightly annoying, and then she went back to the PVC pipe argument, which had escalated in her absence and required her specific intervention. I stood in the yard for a while after that. The oak tree was full-leafed, deep summer green, the kind of green that looks almost too saturated to be real. The brass marker at its base caught the morning light. The kids were arguing about angles. Kofi was drawing diagrams in a notebook. Through the east wing windows I could see the bookshelves going in. The real animal books, per my note, per my promise to a girl who wanted to be a veterinarian and watched to see if I meant what I said. I thought about Marion at 26 borrowing $11,000, walking into a steel shop with a 2-year-old on her hip, and a plan she had no guarantee would work. I thought about her at 60, at 70, building the legal architecture of something she hoped she'd never need. I thought about her in that chair in the third room, looking into a camera, speaking to a board meeting she would never attend, about a granddaughter she was not sure would show up the way she hoped. Not wealth, she had written, legacy. I finally understood, standing in that yard, what the word was actually built from. Not the grand version, not the headline version, the daily version, the version that is made of showing up when it's inconvenient and following through on the things you write in a spiral notebook, and telling an 8-year-old the truth when she asks you a direct question, and building classrooms in a house that used to hold secrets, and sitting on a factory floor long enough to understand what you nearly lost. Legacy is not what you leave. It's what you teach someone to continue. Marion had taught me. I was teaching others. And in the spring, if the information session went the way I thought it might, if the fit was real and not performed, Derek would begin the long and difficult work of learning what his grandmother had tried to show him, in a room, in a house that had turned out to be everything. Not a consolation prize, not a test, a beginning that had been waiting for the right moment to start. I looked at the oak tree one more time, the marker, the light catching the brass. Then I went inside because there was work to do. There always is.